Hi everyone, my name is Natalie. Today I wanted to do my August wrap-up. So a lot of the books that I've read during the month of August I've already talked about in previous videos, so I will link all of them in the description when I get to them. But starting off, I read quite a few of the Wainwright shortlisted books for the year, which you probably all know because I've been talking about it in pretty much every single video I've been doing since I started reading through the shortlist. So the ones that I got to during August was The Last Wilderness by Neil Ansell, Outskirts by John Grindrod, Hidden Nature by Alys Fowler, and The Seabird's Cry by Adam Nicholson, as well as the big picture book The Lost Words by Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris. All of them I've done reviews for, and all of the video reviews will be linked in the description. But I just wanted to sort of talk over the Wainwright very briefly here. I had a lot of fun reading through them and sharing my thoughts with you along the way. I think it is something I could see myself doing again because I love nature writing, and especially I have a soft spot for British nature writing. I like British landscapes and in particular the coastal side of things, and quite a lot of the books on the shortlist this year were set around the coast, especially The Seabird's Cry was definitely very strongly associated with sort of the water element in nature. I also did a blog post where I talked about some of the overarching themes in the shortlist that I found interesting. So if you're curious about my thoughts about the shortlist as a whole, you might want to check that blog post out. That out of the way, that was a big part of my August reading. Another big part of my August reading was a lot of comics / illustrated books, and I actually did a video about some all ages comics, and I talked about all of the comics / picture books that I read during the month in that video, so it will be linked or up in the cards. I've just recently learned how to do that, and the ones that I read during the month of August was Spinning by Tillie Walden, which is a graphic memoir about Tillie Walden's coming of age, coming to terms with her sexuality and her first romantic relationships, but also about her life as a figure skater. And Grävlingens Resa by Cecilia Heikkilä, which is a Swedish picture book that has just come out, and it's about a badger, I think. I think Grävlingens badger in English, about a badger who has been sort of an adventurer in his youth, and he settles down on an island, but then a storm happens, and due to circumstances he ends up being on a new adventure with a friend. So it is a wonderful picture book, and I really hope it gets translated. A picture book that I didn't like as much is The Liszts by Maclear and Julia Sarda. So Julia Sarda does the illustration for this picture book, and she has a wonderful art style. I love how intricate the details is in sort of the spreads. I loved everything about the art. The story I didn't like as much, or I didn't feel like there was much to it, so I enjoyed reading it because of the art, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it based on the story. But I will be looking up for more works by Julia Sarda, so I'm happy I read it. A children's classic that I read this earlier in the month is A Beer Called Paddington by Michael Bond. So this is a very famous children's classic about a beer who comes from Peru, and he ends up sort of lost somewhere in central England, and a family takes him in and helps him, adopts him into their home, and it's about all of the shenanigans that he gets up to, some of them not so intentionally, and it is a really wonderful story. I really fell in love with him as a character, Paddington as a character, immediately, and I haven't read these books before, so It was my introduction to the character, and I haven't seen any of the movie adaptations either, but I really love this style, this sort of mid-20th century children's classics, especially sort of the British coziness as a backdrop. Sort of the post-war time is a kind of a setting that I really like. So Paddington, I had a feeling I would really like it, and I really did. So I'm looking forward to reading through the entire series as an adult reader. A book that I buddy read with Mary from Books and Pizza is The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, and this is obviously the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or the Lord of the Rings saga, which was supposed to be one book, but anyway, so I started reading this with Mary in July and we finished it in August, and this was a really fun rereading experience for me, partly because we read it together, so there was this conversation back and forth, which is something I didn't have the previous time I read it, but also it was interesting to read this quite soon after rereading The Hobbit. So I reread The Hobbit in the beginning of the year, and I realized that I actually like the style in The Fellowship much more. It is more adult in tone. There's much more at stake in this book, as the one ring to rule them all is obviously a much more important quest that they're on, the Fellowship, and the characters in this book as well are much more mature, I think, overall, in comparison to The Hobbit. They act in more thoughtful ways. Frodo, even though he is kind of uncertain about all of the things that he's supposed to do, he still thinks very thoroughly about all of the things that he decides to do, all of his actions. I liked the tone of the story. I liked the description in nature. I read this alongside reading most of the Wainwright books, and that was sort of the perfect combination of reading about nature through nonfiction and reading it through Tolkien's words, because he is obviously very interested in the flora that is sort of the background for these characters. There's this magical tone to a lot of his descriptions of the landscape, of the characters, especially the elves. But I really enjoyed rereading this book, and I look forward to finally continuing on through the trilogy. I haven't read the other two yet, so they're gonna be brand new experiences for me, while I read this book in 2015, I think, the first time. So really enjoyed rereading this. I will link Mary's channel in the description as well. She is wonderful and she has really good taste in books, and it was a lot of fun reading this together with her. So next up, I finally finished Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. This is the story of Anne, who is a red-headed, really talkative, very chatty, colorful person, young girl who is adopted by Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, a sibling pair who are planning to sort of adopt an orphan boy into their home to have some help around the farm, and due to some misunderstanding, Anne ends up being the one who comes, and they decide to keep her. And this book is about her finding a home, finding a place where she can be herself, where she is loved. So it's a coming-of-age story. So I was expecting to love Anne as a character immediately, and I wasn't necessarily drawn to her as naturally as I was expecting to be. Marilla, on the other hand, I loved immediately from the first pages. I liked her as a character. I find her very real, and Anne is she thinks like a young person does, and through that you get the very overdramatic sections where she talks about what happens in her day and what happens in her life, and everything is shaped, all of the events in her life is shaped through her young eyes, which makes sense for the book because it is targeted towards a young reader, and because the narrator is young, you get this juvenile perspective in the book, and I wasn't as drawn to that as I was hoping to be. I liked Anne much more towards the end, where she is slightly more down to earth, slightly more grounded, where she still has her big imagination and she still has this colorful personality, but she isn't quite as overly dramatic or big in her actions and words. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading the other books in the series, because she grows older with the books, and I was really happy to know that she isn't just a child throughout the series. So it's going to be interesting to see how her character changes as the series goes on. And lastly, in the last week of August, there was the Women in Translation Readathon, hosted by Matthew Scarappa and Kendra Winchester, and I did a TBR for the week with all of the ambition that I usually have when I make these TBRs, and I only read one of the books on that TBR, but I'm still happy that I got to at least one, so I consider that a success. And the one that I read was Sweet Francaise by Irene Nemirovsky, and this was translated by Sandra Smith. So basically this is a Second World War kaleidoscope of a character study. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a character study in that there isn't necessarily one main character or even a few main characters, but it's sort of a study of an entire community or an entire country, a group of people, and how they react to the World War. For example, some of the characters in this book are soldiers, some of them are families who are evacuating their homes and their cities. The book opens with some of the characters who are fleeing or who are leaving Paris, but then it moves on to a new set of characters, and again a new set of characters. So you don't follow one set of character over the entire book. You move the focus moves all the time through this book, and there are so many characters that it is sort of reminiscent of the classics like Dickens or Les Miserables. Actually, in a lot of ways this reminded me of Les Miserables because of the way that it's sort of a chronicling of a war like the French Revolution, with this being focused on the Second World War in France, and how it affects people of different classes, of different genders, how it affects people in different ways, but also in the ways that it affects people in similar ways. One of my favorite parts of the book was about the section that was about the German occupation of France. Some homes had to take in German soldiers, and the relationships with the French, who are basically hostages of the German soldiers around the area. The relationships between the French and the German soldiers, and how they weren't supposed to really like each other or even have civil conversations, but they end up having this bond through their similar situation of not being at ease, not being in safety, being constantly in an uncertain world, how both sides are affected by the war in negative ways. This book is, as I said, a kaleidoscope, so it's so many characters that build into this group portrait, and it is amazing how she is able to do this in this book. It is really, really well written and really impressive in the structure and everything that it does. I've written a full review of this actually, which it was a long time ago since I did a written review, I feel like, because of the Wainwright. So I will link my review of this in the description in case you're interested in more of my thoughts, hopefully more cohesive than this. But I was really impressed by this. I wasn't as emotionally connected to it because it shifts the focus and the characters aren't necessarily the main crux of the book. I felt like that ended up having less of an emotional impact on me because of that. but I was really impressed by the book. So I'll leave it at that. If you're interested, I will link my review for this in the description. So those were all of the books that I read in August. If you've read any of these, I would love to hear your thoughts about them, and if you have any recommendations based on what I've enjoyed during the month of August, I would also love to hear that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you're having a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.